Howdy folks, I'm Jenny G, and welcome to this discussion of the new game Cyber Shadow with a very special guest, OneOneTwo. So, how about you introduce yourself, OneOneTwo?
Hi, I'm OneOneTwo. I am a huge fan of 2D platforming games in general. In particular, I'm pretty well known for being a mega fan of the Mega Man franchise. But in general, just 8-bit style platformers, 16-bit style platformers, just retro platformers in general are kind of my bread and butter genre, and I love talking about them. So I'm very grateful to be on this discussion for probably the first new game in 2021 that I beat.
And that's awesome. It's awesome to have you on. I know you're a huge platformer fan, so I thought bringing you on for this would be perfect. And for reference to folks who are listening, Cyber Shadow is a retro-style action platformer, and it was created by one guy. His name is Arn Hunziker, or Mecha Skull is his pseudonym. And he's at Mechanical Head Games, and it was published by Yacht Club Games of Shovel Knight fame. So there's a lot of talent here. And the premise is basically about a ninja named Shadow reawakening in a big post-apocalyptic city to fight the evil Dr. Progan. It's a very challenging game. It's derived from the likes of Shadow of the Ninja. And OneOneTwo, how about you give your overall thoughts about it to start us off?
So that description, by the way, is very apt. This game reminded me a lot of Shadow of the Ninja, which is a pretty cool 8-bit platformer on the NES. For some reason, I'm blanking on who created it. I can just look that up real quick. But it is a very, very fun game that is actually on the Nintendo Switch Online, if you want to give that a try. It's under the NES games. And Natsume, that's the developer of Shadow of the Ninja. My bad. So, yeah, this game reminded me a lot of that. It also... Again, I might be biased here. It also reminded me a lot of Mega Man, not necessarily due to the combat. Obviously, it's swordplay versus gunplay, but the control of Shadow felt very similar. The style of running and jumping was very similar to that of Mega Man, and how it's very free-flowing. And that is definitely something that appealed to me personally, and I think is something that a lot of people will appreciate, where the controls are very snappy. You always feel like you know exactly where Shadow is going to go and where it's going to land.
Definitely. I agree. I thought the game was a great time. I don't usually dabble in Nintendo hard platformers like this. Like, I've played a little bit of Mega Man, and I did really enjoy Celeste and Katana Zero, but it's not usually my go-to. But I still found Cyber Shadow very satisfying for similar reasons to you mentioned, because the movement feels just incredible in this game. Like, at any given moment, you can control precisely where you want Shadow to move, and every time you die, it's pretty much always your fault, because it's just so fluid and smooth, and especially with some of the later moves you get, they just add so many options for you to get out of a dangerous situation.
100%. Mecha Skull really nailed the ability for the player to always feel as if they make a mistake, it's their fault, and that's probably one of the most important things in a retro-style platformer, because if it doesn't feel fair, then there's not much incentive for the player to keep attempting to progress, especially in a game that is as difficult as this one. That's not just... Obviously, 8-bit platformers are known for being quite challenging just due to where they derive from in the NES days, where games were intentionally designed to be difficult, so you would keep renting them from various stores over and over, and for other reasons, to artificially lengthen the difficulty. But even then, I feel like this game in particular was quite challenging, because I haven't played a game in recent memory that really forced a player to be a little more defensive, I would say. The closest that I've seen was actually another game by Yacht Club. I thought Shovel Knight, in particular Plague of Shadows, sometimes forced a player to be a little more defensive with some of their potions, and I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah, you can definitely see where Yacht Club had their influence, because some of the assets are from Shovel Knight, and I like the checkpoint system in this game, because it kind of lets you customize the checkpoint how you want it, so that you obviously will save your progress there, but you can also make it where it refills your spirit points, or where it gives you an extra power up. And in some cases, it doesn't even refill your health. You have to make that an upgrade. And I thought that was a great way to add some balancing to people who aren't as good at games like this, like me, because I'm not usually very good at games like this. So being able to have those extra power-ups and stuff was useful, but it also didn't break the game. And it reminded me of how in Shovel Knight, you can, if you want, you can break the checkpoints, which makes it which makes it like a little bit harder, but it doesn't like break the game completely either.
Absolutely. I thought the checkpoint system was very well thought out and it felt very well paced. That being said, there is a minor complaint where I feel in the later stages, it does feel like it takes ever so slightly too long to reach the next checkpoint. In particular, the second to final chapter, there was one part that I believe was, I want to say was 5 or 6 screens long, where I felt like there should have been a checkpoint a little bit sooner. I won't get into too many specifics, but there were some difficult challenges all in a row that I felt like it was for newer players in particular. I was like, ooh, I could see where a lot of people were probably going to struggle with this, and I really hope this doesn't put off people from continuing with the game at all, because it was a bit much, especially if you don't have the currency to upgrade that specific checkpoint.
Yeah, that one was pretty rough. I think I know what you're talking about. And yeah, some of the later ones do kind of feel like a long gap, because there was at one point where I was basically wanting to get to a checkpoint before I finished my playthrough for the night and like went to bed. But it was a very long time, and I was getting to the point where I would just throw myself into like death pits out of like passive aggression, where it's like, just get me to the end already. Like, but that was like, it was still fair, of course. It just, yeah, those were those few points where there was a long stretch between checkpoints, and luckily they're not super common, but I do know what you're talking about.
Agreed. And I also think to your point that you mentioned about the upgradable checkpoints, that's something that I also have not seen super frequently in platformers before, because in Shovel Knight it's kind of the opposite, where you can break the checkpoint to intentionally make it harder, but this is kind of the reverse, where you can upgrade the checkpoint to make it easier. And I feel like that almost is better a little bit than Shovel Knight's, because the only thing you get from breaking the checkpoint is money. And obviously that is very helpful because you get a huge gem out of that. I don't remember how many currency in particular that is, but I feel like the ability to instead make the game easier as opposed to make the game harder makes it a little bit better for the player in general.
And it fits with the differing philosophies between the two games, because Shovel Knight's a pretty easy game. Like, it has its tricky moments, but it feels more like an NES-style platformer for like a modern generation, where it almost feels like it could have been like an NES-style platformer, just like with a couple quality of life upgrades. So I think having where it defaults to hard and you have to make it easier for yourself was a smart idea, because you have to earn that easiness too, because you need the currency to upgrade the checkpoints, and to get the currency you have to fight enemies. So it makes you earn everything you do, which feels satisfying, especially because there's all the secrets hidden throughout the world that I've only found like a little bit of. I thought I was finding most of them, but apparently on the map I'm like 60% complete. I'm like, oh wow.
Actually, to answer that myself, because I have my my Nintendo Switch directly in front of me, I also found 60% of the items, to be precise. So I know how that feels, where even now I always feel like I feel like I feel like I should have checked that wall, or I feel like I should have went down this pit and see if there's anything in there. And that's definitely a good thing, that it's incentivizing the player to go back and try and find stuff. And actually, speaking of which, one thing I was very grateful for in this game in particular was it is not hard to backtrack. Thank God, because in another ninja action platformer game, The Messenger, I love that game, I 100%ed it, but backtracking that game was a pain.
Yeah, it's like, I love that they have portals going from each level, and I also think it's neat that the whole world is interconnected. Like, levels often cross around on each other. Like, you'll pass by a place you went to earlier in a completely different context, which I did like. I did have a minor criticism with it, where I do think some of the levels did blend together because they did have to be contextualized close to each other. Like, I think it wasn't an issue as much later on or earlier on. It was more so in like the middle chunk of the game, where it was just a lot of ruins or sewers or like just similar kind of looking places. And it wasn't a deal breaker because the visuals are still gorgeous. It's very good sprite work, but that was one of the more minor issues I had with the game.
That's true, and there are two levels in particular that I believe are not identical, but similar enough where I could see players mixing them up, and that's not necessarily a good thing. It's a cool idea, but I also feel like it may be a sort of hindrance towards the game's memorability in some aspects.
Yeah, because I mean, there's still ones that do stand out though. Like, there's one area I really liked. It was around the middle of the game where it's like an overgrown ruin with like plants kind of overtaking the things, and they even had that as like a gameplay mechanic merged into it with these like vines that would grow to like that would basically chase you through their growth, and I thought that was a pretty fun one. So mechanics? Yeah, is there any mechanics or areas that really stood out to you?
I was actually going to specifically mention that one because it reminded me of an upgraded version of the Force Beams from Quickman stage of Mega Man 2. It felt like a little bit more of a fair version of that because the Force Beams in Quickman stage are lightning fast, and this felt a little more laid back, I guess. It allowed the player to kind of suss out what was going on before the plants ultimately killed you if you weren't fast enough. So that was definitely something I liked.
I know what you're talking about with the Quickman stage because I've played Mega Man 2 and that one's tough, and I thought it wasn't as punishing as that. Like it's a very tough game, but it doesn't feel as punishing as like past like NES games or like retro difficult style platformers I've played because there's the plentiful checkpoints, and for the most part you always know what you did wrong, which it would make like because there's lots of points of error, which would make it difficult, but as time would go on, you would be able to suss out which ones you need to do in which order, and it would feel very satisfying to finally get that perfect run through an area and make it to the next checkpoint.
Absolutely. And to that point, actually, the bosses were very good at challenging the player in that very aspect.
Oh yeah, the bosses in this game were great. There was one that stood out to me where it's the first boss you have that's more than one phase. Basically, it's a big guy in a mech suit, basically. And you have like the first phase where he's in the mech suit. And then after you attack him a few times, he jumps out of it, basically. And that one was one of my favorites because I got caught off guard the first time he popped out. And I was only able to do a little bit of damage to him. But having to survive the first phase made me like memorize that first phase so I could just speed through it in moments, and then I could focus on the next phase. But just like it took something that was difficult at first and made me master it to get onto the next challenge, which I really liked.
Absolutely, and I agree wholeheartedly with that analysis of that particular boss fight. It was supremely well made, and it definitely made the player similar to what I said earlier. It made the player be a little more defensive, which I just found fascinating because I find that not many action games, at least nowadays, there's a couple I can think of off the top of my head, but not as many make the player be more defensive in their maneuverability and their attacking, which I thought was excellent, honestly. It definitely encouraged the player to play a little more carefully and memorize the patterns.
Yeah, and the only boss I found kind of weak was the Mecha Dragon in the like water area where you basically have to hop over these water platforms and avoid the dragon. Like that one just felt kind of too slow paced for me, and it wasn't necessarily hard. It just takes a while. So that was probably the weaker of the bosses for me.
I agree. That boss was probably the most the player has to play defensively in the entire game, and I think that might have taken the concept a little too far because, as you said, it takes forever to defeat that boss. I believe my final time on that was 3 or 4 minutes when ideally most other bosses take maybe 1 or 2 if you know what you're doing.
Pretty much. And although the final boss of the game was very good. Like
that's true,
yeah. Yeah, you can go ahead about that one because I know you wanted to talk about it before this.
So I won't get into any particulars just in case anyone here listening or watching wants to play the game, but the final boss was very interesting due to the fact that it had multiple phases, but the first phase was very simple. I remember when I first played the game and I thought this would be the final boss. I was like, really? This is it? This almost feels like a anticlimactic. And then it turned into another phase and it's like, okay, now that makes more sense. But in particular, I thought the boss was very good, but I honestly feel like it should have been 2 separate bosses where the phases should have been separate because the first phase I feel is so simple that it feels tedious to have to go through that every single time you want to get to the other phase, which is much harder.
Yeah, I do feel that one because by the end of the final boss, which took me like an hour or a little over an hour to do because it's very hard. Yeah, like whenever I was in the first phase, I would just kind of mindlessly zone out and just do it because it would just muscle memory at that point. And I do agree, maybe they should have had like the first phase and then have like the other 2 phases be separate or something. And the other 2 phases are very engaging. Like especially the last one, that like my heart was like pumping on my like last try, like about to get it. I was low on health. So was the boss.
I died on that boss when the boss had 2 health. I got hit by one of the attacks and had to do the whole thing over, and that was
I think that happened to me at one point too. It's not a fun feeling.
That's true.
But it was still a very fun final boss, and I like it was so rewarding to actually complete it because, like I said, I haven't played many of these retro NES style platformers that often. So actually getting through one felt like an accomplishment, and it took me a while too. My final playtime was like 12 hours.
I actually, once again, looking at my Nintendo Switch right in front of me, my final playtime was 7 hours, 24 minutes, and 15 seconds, and I had 353 deaths.
Wow, I think I was like in the 600 death range. I forget exactly how many, but yeah, about double your playthrough length, so it makes sense. But you're a lot more experienced than me because you play Mega Man and stuff regularly. And when I play Mega Man, I use the rewind feature because I'm a noob about that. But
it's all good. My take on that is to use the features the game gives to you. So if you ever need to use save states or rewinds in retro platformers, I often encourage it because that way, when they feel like, I don't want to say training wheels on a bike, but that's the best analogy I can think of, where as you get better and better at the game and you play it more and more, you'll eventually won't feel the need to use them anymore, and you can play the game as it was originally designed. And I feel that that's a very awesome way of letting players improve their skill level without feeling frustrated.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a few other things I want to touch on in the game, and there's basically this one section toward the end that we need to talk about because it's awesome. And I'm talking about the motorcycle section and the thing that comes right after that. Like, that is probably one of the coolest sections in the game. It changes up how you play, and it's very difficult, but it didn't feel like it was unfair because lots of times when they have gameplay shifts like that, it'll be annoying because you have to memorize these new controls, but the difficulty stays hard. Where this one was hard, but it wasn't hard to learn the motorcycle controls itself. And it was for like one brief section too, basically.
I completely agree. I would actually go as far as say that was my favorite moment in the entire game, and it wasn't even a platforming section. It was just the level of speed was just right where it felt exhilarating, but it didn't feel aggravating. Which is something that I feel some games fall into the trap of.
Yeah, it was really fast too. It was almost overwhelming to like figure out at that point. And the other part that came right after it is where you're sort of controlling a mech-like thing. And I like that one because it was kind of a power fantasy because you spend the entire game dying a bunch of times to get through. But when you get there, it's still not a cakewalk, but it kind of gives you like extra power you didn't have before, which feels very rewarding that far into the game.
I completely agree. It definitely felt as if it was a reprieve almost from the more difficult sections. In particular, right before and after had some fairly difficult platforming, so it felt like a bit of a step back, which I thought was very welcome. And I heavily appreciated that mech part. That was also awesome.
Yeah, it was almost like a victory lap because you were toward the end, and it's like, just this once, it's going to let you kick some major ass, like destroy a bunch of enemies at once. And that felt very good. And a similar note to that, I like the way that you almost became more powerful as the game went on. Well, because like you get new abilities and stuff, but I almost feel like the bosses earlier were a little bit harder for me because I didn't have as many tools to deal with them. Where some of the later ones, a few exceptions like the final boss, were a little bit easier because I had more of the tools. But I kind of like that because, for one, it's almost rewarding you for you getting this far, and B, it's only easier if you know to utilize all of your tools at once.
The game had a great pace of giving you new abilities and tools, which I thought was very welcome. Every tool you get, there's usually a section afterwards that teaches you how to effectively use it without feeling too much like a tutorial, which was very interesting and definitely something the developer pulled off exceptionally well. And one thing later in the game, I'm trying to phrase this a little bit more vaguely, but there's a part that basically enhances all of your abilities at once. That was awesome.
Oh, I loved that moment. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up, but I didn't want to spoil it. That moment feels so satisfying, both like from the story context and the what you get afterward, because that it's in the end game now. It's like, wow, stuff just got real, and you feel powerful to boot. It's a great moment. I'm glad you brought that up. And speaking of the story, so what did you think of the story? It's not super elaborate, but it is fairly present throughout the experience. So what did you think about it?
That is probably the part of the game I am most conflicted on, because compared to, and I like to compare games like this to kind of its contemporaries, and in particular the two games that come to mind are Katana Zero and The Messenger. And unfortunately, I feel like both of those games tell a better story than this one, because both of those stories felt a little more engaging for different reasons entirely, actually. I felt Katana Zero's story was very impactful because of how dramatic it was, and because of how real it felt in some aspects. Whereas The Messenger's story was very memorable because of how kind of, I don't want to say silly, but there was a lot of jokes and a lot of memorable one-liners to an extent. Whereas Cyber Shadow, I mean, it's definitely very cyberpunk, which I thought was excellent, and I thought the atmosphere was good, but the actual story felt a little cliche with, oh, we have to find a certain person and stop the evil I mean, I guess I can't really complain too much because I'm a Mega Man fan, but finding and stopping an evil doctor, that sounds very familiar. But I could definitely tell they were trying to evoke Ninja Gaiden aspects with the story, and how Ninja Gaiden was very famous for introducing cutscenes for NES games, and that was definitely something that that's something that's aged very well. And I felt Cyber Shadow was trying to go for that same aspect of having cutscenes in between certain levels or certain moments of the game, and I feel like it didn't quite stick the landing as well as Ninja Gaiden.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, the story, it felt like it had potential, but it never really completely landed for me. Because to call us back to Shovel Knight, because of Yacht Club publishing the game, like, Shovel Knight has a very simple story, but it has heart, where, like, there's moments where you can kind of feel for Shovel Knight, even though you don't know much about him. And same, especially with like the other expansions, like especially Spectre of Torment. But this one, it never really hit that level because I don't really care much about Shadow. He's just kind of a ninja, and there's a few other characters who you kind of almost care about, but not quite. And there were still moments that I liked, like the part where you get the final upgrade, like you mentioned. And I did think the ending cutscene was kind of nice, but overall, I thought it was trying to call back to the NES style stories through the presentation, but in doing that, it was also calling back to the just not being particularly interesting, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually read somewhere, I believe it was on Nintendo Life, shout outs to them, I guess, that apparently the developer used about 1/4 of the lore that he came up with for this particular game. And if that is true, I don't know if that was the best idea. I get that it makes it easy to go into sequels, but if that was only 1/4, I'm not sure if I'm going to be particularly interested in the other 75% of it.
Yeah, I feel that way too, because there is a cliffhanger. I won't say what it is, but they're definitely gearing up for a sequel, and I'd be excited for that from the gameplay perspective. But from the story perspective, they still have to prove it to me a little bit. Although you did bring up something earlier that I want to touch on before we wrap up, is the atmosphere in this game is fantastic. Like, the music is it's top tier retro platforming music. It's very catchy. It makes the levels, like, it makes you want to go through the levels even though you're dying a bunch, just because the music is so good. And the sprite work is also just fantastic.
Oh, I was waiting for you to bring up the music. This music is so good. The developer absolutely nailed how a platformer of this variety should sound. And
definitely, yeah.
Oh man, just this is gonna be a soundtrack I remember for quite a while. That is definitely something I am very happy with.
Yeah, I want to double check who the composer is, because I want to make sure we give them proper credit here. Let me see.
Absolutely, and honestly, the music is one of the most important things about just video games in general, in my opinion, because it definitely it serves as sort of a backup to what's going on. And as you said, the atmosphere is certainly very important to this game, and I feel like it wouldn't quite be as good or as impactful if the music wasn't up to snuff, and thankfully it absolutely is, because wow, the chiptune music in this game is great.
Yeah, so I just checked, and it was composed by Enrique Martin, and it seems like they got help from Jake Hoffman from the sound. That's what I researched. I could be wrong, but then that really shows, because I don't think I've seen any other of Enrique Martin's work, but if this is his first, then I'm excited to see what they would do for the sequels. And I mean, Jake Kaufman, always a treasure to hear. So it's definitely a great combination. I want to listen to more of the soundtrack. Just now that I've beat the game, I just want to go back and listen to it some more.
Yacht Club and Mecha Skull, if you happen to be listening to this by any imagination, if you put the soundtracks on Spotify, I will be very happy, because this is definitely something a lot of people need to listen to.
Yeah, it's a great soundtrack, and the sprite work is also great. I did notice a lot of the assets were shared from Shovel Knight, but I don't think it was a huge issue because the game's tone is just so wildly different from that.
Agreed. It's more of a, because Shovel Knight's atmosphere is more, I don't want to say medieval, but that's the closest word I can think of to describe it.
Pretty much.
Whereas Cyber Shadow is more cyberpunk, and I feel that the atmospheric difference definitely, to what you said, made the shared elements not feel as redundant, so to speak.
Yeah, and so I think that about covers everything with the game. So we can try to start wrapping things up. So OneOneTwo, what are your final thoughts on the game?
Cyber Shadow, it being the first new game that I played of 2021. Admittedly, before this, I did play Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, although technically that's a re-release. This being the first new 2021 game I played, this already might be a game that I will look fondly back on in December when I think about Game of the Year, because this game is utterly spectacular. I had such a great time with it. I will probably go back to get the 100% items because I just had so much fun with it. And this is definitely a phenomenal way for platforming fans to start the year. I highly recommend everyone check out this game. It is amazing.
Yeah, and for my final thoughts, I'll say, like, even as someone who doesn't usually like these types of Nintendo hard platformers, well, not dislikes, but just doesn't usually play them, that this game really stuck out to me because it takes everything from that genre, but updates it to still feel fair in a modern sense. There's plenty of checkpoints. You can adjust your difficulty to a minor extent, and the movement is just so smooth and satisfying that it really makes it worth going through, especially with the great music that we were touching on just a second ago. And yeah, I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's on Switch, PS4. It's on Game Pass if you have an Xbox, so just no price of entry there. You can just try it out. And yeah, I would definitely check it out if you're a fan of platformers like that, or just a casual fan like I am. So to wrap things up, OneOneTwo, it was great to have you on. So where can my audience find you?
Well, there's two main places you can find me. I'm over on Twitter at twitter.com/112_112. You spell it first and then the numbers afterwards. And I also stream on twitch.tv/112. Sorry, it's twitch.tv/112 just without the underscore this time. I play a lot of 2D platformers. Like I said, this is my bread and butter genre. I love these type of games, and I love sharing my thoughts and just my passions for just platforming games in general. So if you want to talk to me about platforming games, definitely do so. I love doing that.
Yeah, and it was awesome to have you on. Your enthusiasm about the game really showed, and I think that's great. And for everyone watching, if you liked what you saw here, feel free to subscribe and like and comment and do all those things. If you've played Cyber Shadow, comment about your own thoughts on the game. I'd love to hear it. And I hope you all have a great day. So see you all later.
Bye, everyone.